Shalom and welcome to this home edition of the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be discussing the 20th anniversary of the book called IBM and the Holocaust that exposed IBM's role in the final solution. Well, welcome to the program. And today I have a very special guest. His name is Edwin Black. He is an award-winning, an investigative author, and also presents a program called the Edwin Black Show. Edwin, it's an absolute pleasure to host you on this home edition of the Middle East Report. How are you, my friend?
Oh, Simon, I'm fine. It's a pleasure to be back, although I'm sure you know I would prefer to be back in your studio. In London, we've always had a good time being there, but now the Lord has made it possible for us to speak via this new technology, and everyone, I think, is cognizant of the important messages and methodologies that you are presenting through Rev TV.
Thank you very much. And Edwin, I've interviewed so many people over the past decade on the Middle East Report, and you have to be one of my absolute favorite guests. And you always give us so much insight into the hidden things of darkness that you've been exposing through your investigations and your New York Times best-selling books. Now, we're here in this program today to mark the 20th anniversary of your book called IBM and the Holocaust. Can you give us a little bit of a background, a little bit of context of how you found out about IBM, which stands for International Business Machines, collaboration with the Nazi regime?
Well, it's a very pertinent question because you might remember some years back, more than 20 years back, there was something called the First International Gathering of Holocaust survivors, and my parents are Holocaust survivors. My mother was pushed out of a train on the way to Treblinka out of a boxcar and shot and buried, and my father walked away from a shooting place, and they lived in the woods for 2 years. I convinced them to come to the Holocaust Museum, where they saw an exhibit, and the very first exhibit at that time when you walked into the Holocaust Museum was a great big IBM machine. It was not a computer because there were no computers at the time. It was instead a punch card reader and sorter. And it was not clear to them or to me or to anyone what IBM, which is known for computers, could have had to do with the Nazis. And so I pledged to research that. And when I did, I discovered, to my dismay, through an international investigation and documentation project, that IBM was pivotally involved in co-planning and organizing all 6 phases of the Holocaust: the identification of the Jews, their exclusion from society, the confiscation of their assets, their ghettoization, their deportation, and even their extermination. There was an IBM customer site in every concentration camp. And all of this was micromanaged by its president, Thomas J. Watson Sr., directly from his office on Madison Avenue in New York City, and then later through his international subsidiaries. We published the book, IBM and the Holocaust, which appeared in, I believe, 40 countries in 14 languages simultaneously, adjusted for time zone, and even the Times of London was not allowed to deliver its Sunday editions to Charing Cross Saturday night, so as not to break the embargo. And from that moment, it became crystal clear that that American corporations were not only trading with the enemy, which of course there were hundreds of British and American companies just doing trade with the enemy, but American companies were critically and pivotally involved in the size and scope of the Holocaust itself. It changed history. IBM has never in 20 years apologized. They've never asked for a single comma to be changed. And here we are 20 years later.
Two points I want to make out of what you've just said there, Edwin. The first thing is, can you identify what Holocaust Museum? Was this the new Holocaust Museum that was built in Washington, D.C. in the 90s? And other reference to that one, why hasn't there been any big high-profile legal cases made against IBM and its role in the Holocaust during the Second World War?
And those are great questions. First of all, it was the big Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., the most important one in the United States. And it's interesting to note that that machine, which you could see replicated in the book with the IBM nameplate, was removed from the Holocaust Museum after consulting with IBM, and it was gone to a destination no one knows. The excuse was too many people were looking at it, causing a traffic jam, and which I think is the first time a museum has ever removed an object because too many people were looking at it, and it has been replaced with a smaller machine that does not have the IBM nameplate on the front. As far as lawsuits, there were many lawsuits which were filed or contemplated at the time. There was Polish, there was Gypsies, there were Frenchmen. All of them were not successful due to a variety of reasons, but it is the Court of International Opinion, which and the jurisprudence of history itself, which has delivered the verdict.
Excellent. And if we go back really into the kind of late 19th century, it was, according to my notes here, that Hermann Hollerith made the invention of the tabulating machine to speed up the process of the consensus that America took every 10 years. And this became the machine that was essentially used during the Holocaust. Can you share with us a little bit of this technology that IBM was using, and how did IBM as a company formed back at the turn of the century?
Well, the census of which you speak was mandated by the Constitution to take place every 10 years. You must understand that the act of counting could be done on your hands and toes, but you could not get any information about what you were counting until the Hollerith card was a card about the size of a US dollar bill, and it stored information in the holes that were strategically punched in rows and columns. And then you could send that card with those holes into a reader, and out would come something that never existed before. Out would come information. It was actually, when we speak of the information age, when we speak of what is the information age, the individualization of statistics, the ability to not only count, but identify who has been counted and give their story. That began not in Silicon Valley, but in Berlin in 1933, when IBM turned this people counting and people tracking process, which could actually track any process, person, or place, turned it into a weapon of genocide. They did it knowingly, and they did it for money.
So if we go back to this start of the relationship between IBM and the Nazi regime, according to your book, it really starts in 1933, doesn't it, with the CEO of IBM, Thomas J. Watson. Why did he build up such a strategic alliance with the Third Reich back in 1933 when Hitler came to power? What why did the Nazis want his technology?
Watson was a criminal sociopath, and he was convicted on extortion in the National Cash Register case years before he ever came to IBM. The verdict was overturned on an evidence technicality. He never spent any time in prison. But IBM, or the people who put IBM together, thought that this would be the perfect type of man to run the company that they had in mind. As a sociopath, he had no sense of right and wrong. He just had a sense of getting what he wanted. And what he wanted was a bigger company. And when you're looking at the Depression, the Great Depression, and you're looking at a man trying to get more money and more markets, Watson decided that Nazi Germany would be the perfect growth vehicle for him. IBM, of course, was a monopoly at that time. Even the small companies that were allowed to operate received their material and supplies from IBM through licenses, and so it was all IBM. So it was Watson's idea to become the chief supplier of information to the Third Reich on economics, on the Jewish problem, on the military conquest, on the takeover of Europe, on fascism, on everything that they needed. Everyone expected war, and IBM's thought was that if Nazi Germany was defeated, then that was fine with them. They still had their standing in the United States. If Nazi Germany was successful, then they would undoubtedly stop at Great Britain, and then Watson would be able to have his company be the chief purveyor in the two halves of the geopolitical world, the Nazi half, or the fascist half rather, and the democratic half.
And Edwin, surely there would have been legislation put in place in the United States that put a kind of a boycott and sanctions in place against dealing with the Nazi regime. So how did the CEO of IBM, Thomas Watson, get around this problem?
Well, you would think that, but ironically, in their view, it was the legal participation in genocide. First of all, Hitler comes to power on January 30th, 1933. The persecution of the Jews begins within days. 1935 is the Nuremberg Laws. 1938 is Kristallnacht. 1939, World War II breaks out. During this entire time, IBM is their strategic partner, and there is no legislation in the United States stopping IBM from partnering up with Nazi Germany. Of course, there were boycotts. There was an anti-Nazi boycott, which was boycotting pharmaceuticals and China and toys and tourism and trying to bankrupt the Third Reich. But this technology was sub rosa to a large degree. People really didn't understand what it did. They still don't understand today what it did. It was a quiet counting machine. And this quiet counting machine was quite Promethean. It could help advance the cause of peace, or the other edge of the sword could be wielded, and it could be used as a killing machine. And it proved itself to be a very effective killing machine. It was only in the summer of 1941, just before Pearl Harbor, that There were various rules and regulations against working with Nazi Germany. Remember, the war has been on since 1939, and Watson and IBM skirted that by working through their overseas subsidiaries in Sweden, in Vichy, France, in Portugal, in Spain, Holland, various places. They skirted that, and they even engaged in a large-scale fraud where they would backdate correspondence and contracts to make it look like it had all started before that. And of course, then we enter, we have Pearl Harbor, we declare war on Japan, and as a result of declaring war on Japan, Germany declared war on the United States, and it was Pearl Harbor that made Winston Churchill exhale a sigh of relief that finally the U.S. would be fighting alongside Great Britain.
Oh, absolutely, Edwin. And when we talk about this IBM machines, and we know, for example, that Hitler was fascinated with the latest technology. He certainly used this in his military tactics, such as the Blitzkrieg, using tanks and infantry backed up by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. But he was also fascinated with the latest technology. So how did this IBM technology help to categorize the whole German population, to categorize them as Jews and also people antisocial, those that were a threat to regime, the racial profiling of individuals, as well as their sexual orientation? How did he use the information that he got from this machine in order to start to pursue his Nazi ideology, and that's of Mein Kampf, which we saw with the Nuremberg laws?
Well, let's answer first by looking at your question and your sentence in which you mentioned the Panzer tanks, you mentioned the Blitzkrieg, you mentioned the aerial bombardment of the Luftwaffe, that's the Ju-88 bombers. All three of those were engineered and produced thanks to an American company called General Motors, which did so secretively through its subsidiary known as Opel. And so General Motors produced the Blitz truck for the Blitzkrieg, the indispensable parts for the Ju-88 bombers, the Panzer tank engines, torpedo heads, and landmines. Now, as to how this system worked, it started out when IBM said to the Nazis, "We are the solutions company, and there's no solution we won't give you," which turned out to be they were even willing to give the final solution. So Hitler had various questions. Everything was custom made. IBM would say, "What do you want to know? What do you want to do?" And IBM would find a way to do that. And Hitler's very first question was, how many Jews do I really have in Germany? Because we have Jews with these big fur hats and their little hair things. And we have other Jews in three-piece suits. And we also know that there are Jews who are running around practicing not Judaism, but Catholicism, Lutheranism, etc., because they adopted the racial definition of a religion, not by who went to temple and who went to synagogue, but it was in their blood, Race und Blut, race and blood, which came out of the eugenics world. And so the Carnegie Institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, made it clear that a Jew was not just someone who practiced a certain religion, but had a certain blood trace going back generations. So he wanted to know, how many of these enemies do we have in our country? And it was IBM that said, "We will solve that for you. We'll hire all the people, hundreds, tens of thousands. They will go door to door. They'll take a census. They'll ask questions about religion and nationality and cultural background. will send all these forms into one warehouse at Alexanderplatz in Berlin. And day and night, we will be typing in this census information. In one column, we will record the religion. In a second column, we will record the mother tongue. So is your religion Islam? Is it Lutheranism? Is it Judaism? Is it Catholicism? Is your mother tongue Polish? Is it French? Is it German? We will also ask your nationality. Are you of German stock? Are you Ukrainian stock? Italian stock? We will also ask, what is your profession? Are you a tailor? Are you an auto mechanic? Are you a banker? Are you a journalist? And then your location. And at the rate of 64,000 cards per hour, bang, suddenly Nazi Germany knew exactly how many Jews of Polish extraction were engaged in the fur trade in Munich. They never had that specificity before. Once they had that level of specificity, then they moved from identification to phase 2, which was exclusion, pauperization. They juxtaposed all the Jews identified in the academic roles against the faculty list, the doctors against the medical association list, the lawyers against the bar association. All these lists were put together, and the Jews were identified in those professions. They were all fired. Third, we get to confiscation. All the banks in Nazi Germany were running on IBM punch cards. You have the names of the Jews, you have their bank accounts, you have their savings accounts, you have their assets. Grab those assets, target them for organization, immediately put a 25% flight tax on them. The fourth vector was ghettoization. One day, all the Jews are in their middle-class homes, and on that one day, they're all moved across town into these bombed-out slums from World War I. These ghettos, 8 families to an apartment. Everybody knows their street. Everybody knows their address. Everybody knows their stairwell. Everybody knows their floor. It was traffic management from IBM. And then the fifth level is these ghettos start emptying their residents into trains, and those trains are all run on IBM punch cards. And without those punch cards, those trains could not run. The boxcars would be lost. And so those trains were running on the IBM punch cards. And of course, these all took custom-made programs. And indeed, as IBM moved across the continent in cadence with the Nazi takeover of Europe, they opened up new subsidiaries and new depots along train stations where they would process these locomotives and these boxcars, and these trains would travel 1 to 2 days. And then they got to the concentration camp. No waiting. Generally within 40 minutes, the Jew was dead, on his way to becoming smoke. And IBM even created the extermination by labor program, where they categorized all the Jewish skills against all the Jewish, against all the SS slave requirements. We need to build a building. We'll find the construction workers. We need to staff the fields. We'll find laborers. Those people were worked to death. There was an IBM customer site in every concentration camp, and the name of that site was uniform. It was the Hollerith Abteilung, that is the Hollerith department. Most of them had machines. Some had just counting systems. The one in Dachau, for example, was in a great a concrete blockhouse across from the main gate. There's a picture of it in my in my book, IBM and the Holocaust. And in Auschwitz, it was in Auschwitz III, which is known as Monowitz. It was just near the sports field. We, of course, published the phone number of IBM in Auschwitz. IBM said, "You'll never find us in Auschwitz." We have the phone book. We even know what their phone number was. And so IBM had to make custom programs. There was even an IBM code for all these victims that you mentioned: homosexual, gypsy, communist Spaniard, civilian prisoner. And those, in the case of the Jews, the code was 8. And then their disposition, according to the IBM system, the secret IBM concentration camp codes was code 6, was Sonderbehandlung, special handling, which means gas chamber. IBM was never called to account to answer for its crimes during World War II, not after World War II, not since my book has been published. And I assure you, tomorrow morning, you will not get a call from any IBM attorneys saying, "How dare you accuse us of genocide?" In fact, IBM will be silent. They will hope that no one has heard you ask me the question or has heard me answer it.
Which makes this program and the work you do so important, Edwin. What was interesting, looking through at my notes here, that the CEO of IBM at the time, Thomas J. Watson, received a percentage of every Nazi transaction. And even in 1937, he was honored by Hitler in Berlin himself, which showed that there was a strategic alliance between IBM and the Nazi regime that lasted 12 years. So clearly Hitler valued him very much, and also what IBM could offer the Third Reich in terms of being able to implement the final solution. How much do you think the US government at the time, even though they didn't enter the war, as you said, until December 1941 with Pearl Harbor, were very much aware of IBM's role in the final solution?
They were very aware. Let's take the details. Watson had a 1% share of all the business going on to the Third Reich. That means he had a vested interest. I already told you he was a sociopath. He is actually an unindicted war criminal under the Genocide Treaty as an accomplice to genocide. You couldn't even paint a corridor in an IBM bomb shelter in Germany without getting his specific permission, because this was money being spent on paint, and that would come out of his pocket in a certain way. You asked how much of the country of the government was aware of it. Let's answer it this way. Every time Watson went to Germany, which was frequently, he sent a notice to his friend, FDR, and he said, "Please be aware I'm going, and send me good wishes." Second of all, the State Department was the bag man for the communications between various IBM entities across Europe in the first years of World War II. So the machines blocked in war-torn Poland were then moved into Romania for the next census through the efforts of the commercial attaché. The typewriter in the Berlin embassy was used by IBM senior staff to write their reports back to Watson. And by the way, all these contracts for all these millions of dollars, and Nazi Germany was the biggest overseas account of IBM, the second biggest account of any kind after the Social Security program in the United States. All oral agreements, nothing written. Why? They didn't want a guy like me coming around and finding the contracts. But the Nazis kept great notes because they didn't trust IBM for the commission, and I got those notes. So the little guys were aware of it. The Department of Justice was aware of it. They actually sent off a FBI investigator to investigate how IBM was moving all these Nazis back and forth between offices. And of course, Roosevelt was there. So there's enough guilt to go around. You have to remember, for Normandy, IBM was doing the weather reports for the Nazis and for Eisenhower. So they were playing both sides. There was even a group of military men in the U.S. military called the IBM soldiers. These were IBM employees who were put into special units. They went into liberated Europe. They secured the machines. They made sure the airplanes didn't bomb them, and they got those machines working for the occupation powers. In fact, even when Berlin was liberated, these IBM machines were all congregated into one or two places, and they started to calculate the amount of, during the summer of 1945, the amount of radiation death you would see in Japan after the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. There were many people in the United States who understood what IBM was doing. Many objected. Many could not stop their relationship with IBM because they could no sooner turn off their relationship with the IBM punch card system as today you could turn off your relationship with computers. Everyone was using it. Everyone is using computers now. And that is why IBM was never called to account for what it did until my book. And when my book came out, they said nothing. They were not called to account, but the judgment of history has been rendered.
Absolutely. And I just want to quote something here. And this is from the CEO of IBM in Germany. Is it Heidinger, who was known to be a massive Nazi supporter? He says, "I see this system of machines as a virtual calling from God," he went on to say, "whilst opening up a new IBM facility in Berlin. I felt it almost a sacred action," he declared emotionally. "I pray the blessing of heaven may rest upon this place." And the next day, standing and next to him was Tom Watson, standing next to him. I mean, this is extraordinary. The German CEO of IBM and the role that they played, saying this was a divine innovation that God had given the Nazis. Absolutely horrific.
And what you are just now citing, IBM will never be able to say, well, it was in Germany, we weren't aware. Whatever happened in Germany, whatever was said, all these letters were always translated and transmitted to Thomas Watson's office. And so we were able, by getting those records that IBM tried to keep out of our hands, we were able to see not only what the Nazis said about the IBM equipment, but what Thomas Watson knew was being said. So for instance, when the man that you spoke of said, we're hiring new repair staff, you understand that these machines were clippity-clop, and they got out of sync on a regular basis. They had to be serviced once every 2 weeks on site, whether that was downtown Frankfurt or whether that was Auschwitz or Dachau. And so IBM knew exactly all the progress was being made, and IBM literally knew where the next invasion was, because they moved their cards, for instance, in Holland into position 2 weeks before the Nazis invaded.
Unbelievable. And can you share with us a little bit more detail about how these machines actually worked? and the codes they had. Like, for example, code 1 was for political prisoner, 2 was for Bible researcher, 3 was for a homosexual, 4 was for dishonorable military discharge, 5 was for clergy, 6 for a communist, 7 for a foreign civil worker, 8 for a Jew, as you mentioned before, and then 9, someone who's antisocial. Then we got habitual criminal, 10, 11 habitual felons, 12 a gypsy, 13 a prisoner of war, 14 a convert prisoner, 15 a hard labor detainee, and 16 a diplomatic council. How were they able to, the Nazis able to acquire all this information, and how did this IBM machine categorize people into racial groups, into gender groups, into professional groups, or even into political opposition, so the Nazis
Okay,
could
okay.
identify who they were
So,
dealing with?
uh, just further clarity, you used the term Bible researcher. Uh, a Bible researcher was Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah.
So that's what they meant by Bible research. That was the term that they used. Um, you have to think of a music box. A music box has prongs, different prongs. And as it proceeds and strikes the various chords, out comes a certain type of music. So this was basically the devil's music box. Now, there were many, many, many types of cards, many, many types of machines, many, many types of configurations. But what you just rattled off was the concentration camp codes. So there was a prisoner card, which I publish in my book, a picture of that. And various information from that prisoner card is recorded by hand with pen and paper, but then it's punched in. And there's a mark on that card called Hollerith Erfasst, which means registered by the Hollerith machine for the Hollerith department. That information was then punched in. Are you a man? Are you a woman? Are you a Jew? Are you a Jehovah's Witness? Are you a homosexual? Are you a gypsy? Now, these were the categorizations that were just for the concentration camps. So these were on the prisoner cards. Interestingly enough, the very first Auschwitz tattoo was an IBM number. It was tattooed on the hand. It was this, the Hollerith number was the prisoner number, and that became your tattoo number until that system was completely subsumed by many other numbering systems. So they had this information, and it would then be punched in, and then it would be tabulated. And you could say, I want to know all the gypsies in a certain in the camp. I want to know all the communists in the camp, the Jews. These reports were given once a week and motorcycled in to a T-shaped building staffed by at least 24 IBM machines. This was called D2, and it was at a camp called Oranienburg. There's a camp called Sachsenhausen, and it's adjacent to Oranienburg. So all these various systems were punched in. But what's most important to understand is that for each system that we're talking about, whether it was trains, the concentration camps that you just talked about, extermination by labor, you had to start with a mock-up by IBM. We have those mock-ups. They have the IBM logo on it, which was Deutsche Hollerith Maschine Gesellschaft, the German Hollerith company, De Homag. Then the design was approved, modifications were requested, and then they were custom printed by IBM and only IBM. They actually went to court for a trademark infringement during World War II in Berlin to make sure no one else would print up their cards, that they were the sole exclusive provider. Then the machines had to be wired. Then the personnel had to be trained, and then they had to be repaired. And all this was done continuously with the help of IBM repairmen and IBM and engineers. And if they would just stop the constant supply of cards, each card could be used just one time, it would have been like having rifles without bullets. That is how it happened. And that was IBM's contribution to the Holocaust. Nothing could be done in an organized fashion unless it was done within the parameters of the IBM technology. And as the technology progressed, as the demands progressed, they progressed in synergy, and out came 6 million dead.
Incredible. Edwin, can you put into context this IBM technology in light of the Holocaust? If the Nazi regime didn't have access to this IBM, what's equivalent of like a big computer, but essentially a punching machine, if they didn't have access to these machines, do you think the Nazis would have been able to carry out the final solution, or are we looking at a very dramatically reduced number of Jewish deaths during the Holocaust?
There always would have been extreme death with or without the IBM company, because in the East, there was the so-called Holocaust of bullets, where the Einsatzgruppen and others were involved in the mass murder of Jews in trenches and in ravines with machine guns. But that was manual. And at some point, it became unbearable. Even Himmler said that our men just can't sleep at night, knowing that they've shot these many people, no matter what they told them. It was the industrialization, it was the automation of the murder that gave us the high numbers, the astronomical numbers, the numbers that you knew before you started this show, the numbers which we have talked about for decades. That is the 6 million Holocaust, that is the Hollerith Holocaust, the IBM Holocaust, and would have never seen that level of genocide had it not been for IBM. It just would have been, in my opinion, a series of massacres. But it went from being a heartbreaking series of massacres to an unbelievable and unforgettable scar upon humanity, that in some locations 99% of the Jews were found and killed, and that 6 million were ultimately killed, and they tried to do many, many more. And even the Blitz of London was achieved through the calculations done by these IBM punch cards. And of course, they were working not only on the buzz bombs, but they were working on the much bigger missiles, which they did not finish, but which they intended to use not only to bombard London, but probably to bombard the United States as well.
Edwin, I've got two aspects to my next question, which I think are important to cover. The first one is, how much financial gain was IBM actually making from their, what I can only describe as evil collaboration with the Nazis? And the second point, was any of the information that they were able to have on the Third Reich able to be used by British or American intelligence to help the war effort?
All right. The amount of money was extraordinary. In today's terms, it would be called billions. Let's look at what IBM, they had one office, maybe two in Germany at the start of the Hitler regime. They went off to dozens of branches and licensees. In many cases, they took not only money, they took timber, they took assets, they took payment of all types. They were able to own lands. The exact numbers were kept off the books, but the personnel went from dozens in 1933 to thousands by the time the war broke out, just in Dehomag itself. And of course, Dehomag was in league, this German entity, with licensees in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in France, Vichy France, in occupied France. And so the numbers were kept off the books, but this entity, now known as IBM Germany, IBM Deutschland, that's the same company. They just renamed it. They didn't bankrupt it. They didn't reorganize it. It's the same company. And so the towering financial empire that IBM Germany is today, the second largest asset in the IBM empire, and much, much more is due to this extraordinary collaboration. I could give you numbers, but they would just be molecules. We do attempt to give some number reference in the book, but all of it was hidden, and only internal documentation revealed how many millions of dollars per month in those days was being made. And of course, those are billions in today's money. Interestingly enough, right after the war, IBM put in for war claims. That means they knew while all of Europe is decimated and people are bombed out, IBM is so organized that they put in a war claim for bomb damage, for cardboard boxes, and for machines damaged. They knew exactly what was damaged in each place. And stay seated, the bonus points were given to all the branch managers and salesmen for the level of business that they did in each territory.
Unbelievable. We come down to the last 10 minutes of the program, Edwin. I have to really ask you that this collaboration with IBM, according to your book, IBM and the Holocaust, actually even went to the dying days of the Third Reich after the death of Hitler. And you provide evidence, the fact that they found one of these IBM machines or IBM representatives doing business with the Third Reich, even up until April 1945.
Yes, of course. In fact, when the United States came into Berlin, there were none of these machines were purchased. They were all leased. They had monthly stipends, monthly leasing arrangements, and of course, they were always insured by either Hartford, Connecticut insurance company, Lloyd's, or other types of insurers in Great Britain. So there was an IBM senior official in 1945 who gave the last check for leasing of the machines to an American soldier and said, please give this check to Mr. Watson. In fact, it was always understood that people were dealing not only with IBM, but with this celebrated man, Thomas J. Watson, who was, I should have mentioned earlier, given a fabulous ceremonious award in Berlin in 1937, where they invented a brand new award for this guy in what was described as the biggest party and banquet to ever grace the streets of Berlin. And he was given a sash by Hitler himself. There's a famous picture of Watson and Hitler having tea. It's the very last page of my book. And so, yes, everybody knew and everybody tried not to know. But what IBM did is unforgettable.
Absolutely. And Edwin, we're doing this interview to mark the 20th anniversary of the publication of your book and your extraordinary research, IBM and the Holocaust. What would you like to see achieved on this 20th anniversary? And what pressure do you think can be placed on IBM to acknowledge the role that they played in the final solution, in which over 6 million precious Jewish lives were murdered at the hands of the Nazis on an industrial scale?
IBM is never going to apologize. It's not in their DNA. No other company would be allowed to be this active in mass murder and still be existent. The German companies were certainly dismantled and taken over, and no one has been able figure out how IBM survived, except for the fact that they were indispensable to the war effort on both sides. I think that what most people can derive from my book at this particular moment in time is that history repeats itself. And we are now seeing what Hitler did with punch cards at the rate of 64,000 cards per hour, and compare that to what can now be done with Twitter, with Google, with supercomputers, with AI, with handheld devices. And I think that we're headed toward a very dark, dark path back to where we were when when technology became a very, very evil tool in its Promethean option. And I just want people to look at what was done with the slow technology and now contemplate what can be done at the speed of light.
And that does bring this whole issue of IBM and the Holocaust really up to date for the 21st century. And so my real next question to you, Edwin, do you think that these big tech giants have far too much power? And why are they determining that only a certain extreme liberal ideology is acceptable, whilst any other, maybe a conservative opinion or support for President Trump is completely unacceptable in their books? And essentially what we're seeing in our day really is the erosion of freedom of speech. And, that's a very dangerous warning sign for us all, isn't it?
We are seeing that the levers, doors, and gateways to social interaction, communication, the media, discussion, the free exchange of ideas are now being controlled by a small group of technocrats. And I believe that we are now seeing a new dawn, a new dark dawn of what we saw before. I believe that society at large must act quickly to nationalize and declare as utilities these companies, which without any due process whatsoever ever can deprive you of your platforms, of your information, of your files. Amazon can disconnect your servers. Can you imagine if the phone company could disconnect your phones because they didn't like the topic that you were discussing, and it's all in the hands of the small clique that is controlling the keyboard. Now remember, the next move is Apple and Google can decide, well, we make all the phones, the Apple phone and the Google Android, like I have. And they could say, not only are we disconnecting your accounts, we're disconnecting your servers, we're going to disconnect your phone. And as we approach a cashless society, people are going to be in digital ghettos. The digital ghettos are starting even now. We are looking at a dark new dawn, and people need to stop and make sure that we still have our democratic systems in place. And what IBM did in the Holocaust can never be repeated, not in China, not in North Korea, not in London, and not in the United States.
No, absolutely. And we're down to the last, just under 2 minutes of the program, Edwin. So do you have a message to our viewers? Because, I mean, you're a genius, and that's the only way I can describe you. Your painstaking research, your ability to find to expose the darkness, essentially, with the books that you produced. What message would you have for our viewers during this very dark times in which we're all living in, where we see the erosion of democracy and our liberty and our freedoms that we haven't really seen for the past 80 years?
Well, I have said repeatedly, there is no way you can plot your future without comprehending and understanding your past. Right now, we're in a 1984 presage where history is being erased, history is being modified. You yourself could have thousands of files on some program, and now it's been deleted by Amazon or Google, and it's going to be very much harder to see ahead and see behind when our history is being obliterated. And this means society will very soon be going into its future blindfolded. This is one of the many messages of IBM and the Holocaust. It's one of many messages that I'm speaking about today, the digital ghetto, where you can go to your rooftop and scream at the top of your lungs and no one will hear you. And not only has that been achieved, but now they're taking away the rooftop itself and there'll be no way to be heard. We are going into dark, dark times.
Edwin Black, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on this home edition of the Middle East Report. And I want to thank our viewers for watching this program today. Thanks to the incredible research done by Edwin Black, we all know the role that IBM played in the Holocaust. And if it hadn't been for IBM, then it's very likely that the final solution wouldn't have actually happened, or the extent of it wouldn't be happened. And that's why we have to remain vigilant. This is why we have to support Israel and the Jewish people during this dangerous times, but also it's a time that we need to speak up for our democratic freedoms as they're under threat. So thank you for watching me. Thank you for watching this edition of the Middle East Report.